All right, guys. Welcome back to the Bastion Black Performance Podcast. Um, I would like to thank my first official sponsor. A dear friend of mine was so auditorially unpleased with the sound of my first couple of podcasts that he sent me a microphone that is better than my previous microphone. So we'd like to thank the lovely Alex Gack and his wife Elizabeth Gack, current rulers of Gakistan, for being my current sponsors of this episode. So obviously, like when I started the podcast, like history and stuff's my jam. I kind of intended to sort of go off the deep end into World War II related things, which I'll definitely get to. But obviously, then Russia was like, hey, you know what, Ukraine, we're gonna hit that. So it kind of makes sense to sort of talk about the things that are going on currently. So if you're following along on the screen here, so I've got again all the information that we have on the internet. It's second or third hand. It's the best that I can come up with. If people have access to any better information, obviously I'll take that. So I've got a general map pulled up of kind of the general situation of the front lines and of the kind of the opposing forces right now, and then I'll pull up just my regular map of the Ukraine so we kind of know what we're talking about here. So as it sits right now, so we're still talking about kind of the four axes of advance, and the Russians are still advancing on Kiev itself. Lots of big battles in Kharkov, which is right around here, and then if we're down into Luhansk and Donetsk down here, and then kind of the major news, if it's true today, is that supposedly down here the Russians took the town of Kherson and the corresponding bridge. So if we zoom in here, so Kherson has a major bridge over the lower portion of the Dnieper River here. So obviously, so that would have been these groups coming from Crimea, and like I stated in the previous video, or previous podcast rather, there are, as you can see them, there's two ways that the Crimean Peninsula actually attaches to the mainland, and then there's a highway or an interstate network that kind of comes up both of those. So obviously, being able to take the major bridges that are in Kherson here and get across the Dnieper prior, as you can see, that kind of gets them away from all of any more major natural barriers from being able to join up in Kiev, or from moving along in kind of a lateral motion here going to the west over to Odessa. And so I'll kind of work my way around a little bit in the counterclockwise here, just so we can try to get a little bit of an understanding of what's going on here. So obviously, one thing I want to state before we kind of go, that I hope everyone tries to we use the map to try to get an association for how ballsy and probably too risky that the Russians were with their main plan. So like I said, so if we kind of flash back real quick to our other map here, is so coming from Gomel here in Belarus. So the Russians have four main axes of advance. So coming directly south out of Belarus towards Kiev here, coming out of western Russia towards Kharkov. So this is Kharkov here. Then coming from the separatist areas, into Luhansk and Donetsk here, which are already areas being fought over, and then coming across the Kerch Peninsula into Crimean Peninsula and coming up from the south here. So like I said before in the previous video, so this is kind of keeping with sort of traditional Russian doctrine of deep battle, or deep operations, which is that one, you need to attack an enemy across multiple points if possible, so that you can dissipate their force. And so obviously that's going to help prevent an enemy from being able to send overwhelming reinforcements, supplies, logistics, things like that to any one thrust. And then if operated and if implemented really well, then an attacking force kind of presses their advantage, and then when it's clear that one of these axes is about to break through or does break through, then they should have standby forces that can be moved into there from a tactical standpoint, but also from an operational standpoint, meaning you have reserve forces that are prepared to move as needed into wherever the breaches come from. So theoretically, and when implemented well, obviously that does work really well. But what I want us to try to understand here is like, so if we look at, so coming out of Gomel here, so on this, major road system coming towards Kiev, so this is Voronezh, this is Kursk here, and then coming down to Belgorod, into Kharkov here, and then coming coming south from Voronezh into this major highway that runs from Luhansk, going east and west, and then down to Rostov on Don. So I want you to think about how long the logistics, so what we call the log train in the military, the logistics lines of the Russians realistically are. So you have four separate axes. So you need four separate logistical support systems, four separate setups for supporting fires, whether artillery, self-propelled artillery, air power, multiple launch rocket systems, things like that. But now, because the country of Ukraine itself is in between all of your axes of advance, if they can't advance quickly enough or deeply enough, they can't mutually support each other. And this is why I always like to, again, I'm a super nerd, but this is why when I'm at work and or otherwise bored, I always just like look at maps and try to get an association for stuff. So if we look at the major road network, and typically rail networks follow along with major road networks, at least roughly speaking. So look how spread out all of these individual places for logistics train are, and how far they are from each other. So, so guys who work, maybe you work in the trucking industry, or you do, the logistics industry and stuff like that. So obviously, as we send things out, from hubs, so typically we're sending from a hub to another hub, before we can dissipate it down to smaller units. So there's only so many places that you can go with major traffic. And so, the Ukrainians being able to hold up, so especially around Kharkov here, and then around Kiev, and being able to kind of, somewhat contain these advances, prevents them from being able to mutually support each other logistically speaking, which means that they are reliant on, so if you're up here around Kiev, they're reliant on everything that goes through Gomel and down south here. If you're in Kharkov, everything has to go through Voronezh and then through Kursk and down through here. And then if you look at this distance, so just, looking at our basic map, so going around Ukraine, I mean, that's 200 miles, in linear distance, not as the crow flies, but obviously, parts of it are still closed off that the Ukrainians occupy. So very big deal for the Ukrainians to keep these interior lines and for the Russians to be forced into these exterior lines. And so kind of other things that we, kind of need to take into account there. So we don't have a breakdown yet of the actual forces that the Russians have committed as far as, how many armored divisions, mechanized versus motorized, infantry divisions, things like that. So I don't honestly have really good numbers for that, but obviously we will kind of, guesstimate the best that we can. But, one thing to also keep in mind is that infantry divisions also have armor attached to them. It just means that it's more of a supporting role and it's smaller total numbers than an armored division has. An armored division is obviously focused around the armored punch that it has. So it has a lot more armored vehicles relative to the total number of personnel that are in them. Typically, your armored elements are the individual combat units are smaller in total personnel, but the divisions themselves are usually larger because they require such a large support network. So in America, and the numbers are always vary a little bit, because obviously like we have armored divisions in America, but they've kind of been broken down and reorganized into things to support the types of missions in the global war on terror. So they're not set up for kind of this classic conventional warfare thing. And the Russians are, probably more set up that way, but they've been doing some, counterinsurgency things in the last 30 years as well. But so typically they say that a U.S. armored division in action, so obviously if it's just sitting there not doing anything, it's going to use less, a lower number of supplies. But when it's in action, a U.S. armored division uses, up to, like somewhere around 500,000 gallons of fuel per day. Now, a Russian armored division, at least on paper, is supposed to be roughly 30 to 50% smaller than than an American division. I don't have a really good breakdown of their total vehicle number, so let's just say that it's roughly 30%. 30% lower as far as, its actual requirements of fuel and things like that. But if you look at, so obviously you can use trains and other trucks to get fuel somewhat close. But when you talk about like the actual delivery trucks that, the military would use to take things from the depots and actually to the places where they're going to be refueling the vehicles, that are in action, Most of those trucks only hold about 2,500 gallons, or if they're also carrying another tank with them, 2,500 to 5,000 gallons would be about the maximum that those trucks are carrying. So if you're using 500,000 gallons per day, and you're carrying 2,500 gallons, so that's 200 trucks per day, or an equivalent of 200 truck trips per day. If a Russian division is a little bit smaller than that, let's say 30% lower. So let's say it's more like around 120 to 150 truck trips per day, and that's per division. Infantry divisions will use a little bit less fuel, but that's a substantial amount when we think about, like, that is every single day. And so obviously, as trucks get destroyed or they get stuck in the mud, they get broken down, whatever it is, like, that starts to impact that a lot. And so we've seen a lot of stories about the Russians, having very big logistical problems. And to me, it makes perfect sense. It's one, they haven't done any large scale operations basically since, I mean, I guess you could say the first and second Chechen wars, but those were not large scale in the way that, the Soviet-Afghan war from 79 to 89 was. And so they're out of practice with doing that. And then the fact that they do have 4 separate axes as of yet that are connected to each other, that's a really big potential problem. And it's definitely, then you add with that the fact that Russia has a large component of conscripts whose their training level is obviously lower, and then their motivation level is suspect in a lot of them. And so what that typically means is that with lower training and lower morale, you take more vehicle damage. People don't perform the maintenance on the vehicles, or they don't drive them at the speeds and in the ways that are conducive to, keeping them, running and keeping them mechanically sound over long periods. It also means that just, they're going to take longer to do things. They're more apt to take the wrong directions. They're more apt to drive it off of, like, bridges into creeks and things like that, and we've seen that, in pictures already coming out of the Ukraine. So kind of just keeping that in mind, which is really, really a big deal. And you're kind of seeing it, in front of you, like how big of a deal logistics are. So kind of, I want to move on a little bit here. So what I've been a little bit surprised at, and I wondered how this was going to play out. So I was thinking a lot about Kharkov. So obviously Kharkov has been a major focus of operations, of the Russians, and it makes sense. Kharkov sits on a very healthy network of major roads and somewhat minor roads that, could definitely still hold significant military vehicle traffic. But what I wondered is, so taking over Kharkov, it looks like, if we kind of flash back to, sort of our movement map here, it does look like the Russians are using the advance in Kharkov here, and then trying to close on to, Ukraine moving along westward from Kharkov. So if we see here, so there are highways that move over here, but as we're up here around like Chernihiv and things, and so obviously the main thrust towards Kiev is coming from here. And so as we kind of flash back into so we're up around Chernihiv here, and then we get over into the Kharkov area over here. So the highways, the interstates that come out of Kharkov. So while there is this major one that does move, so what's it called? MO3 here, M03. It does move towards Kiev, going west. It kind of takes a little bit of a roundabout way, but what I kind of didn't say in the last video, because it sort of hit me like at the end, and I kind of couldn't get myself retracked to sort of talk about it again, is what kind of would be worrisome for me, and what I wonder if the plan is here is, so we know we have the elements from the Crimea that are coming up on these two highway networks here. So coming here towards Kherson, and then coming up towards Melitopol here. So now we also think about, so the Russians are over here in Luhansk and Donetsk area. They're around Mariupol and all that. So if the Russians are able to take Kharkov, or at least take enough of Kharkov that they can get access to the major north-south running interstate here, E105 rather, coming down through Dnipro City and Zaporizhia here, is so not only would this give them the ability to connect these two axes directly to each other, but if we think about what that would do as far as sectioning off the separatist area. So we know this is the separatist area here, and so we have our Kursk up here. So if they're able to come and sort of join up these two units here, that would section off the separatist section over there. And I kind of, if I had to guess, I think that's what the Kharkov thrust is for. Is to, one, obviously just take something with a major road network, but is to then to try to push south into the interior, to be able to link up these two axes, these two thrusts, and then section off the separatist area, because again, I'm way more formidable, at least from an intellectual standpoint. Tactically and operationally, I'm not a good strategic person because a lot of politics and things come into the strategic realm on there. But one thing that's been surmised that seems very reasonable, very possible, is that Putin's plan is basically to carve up Ukraine. Is to basically leave it still as Ukraine, but to essentially cut off, the separatist section here, the section that is more ethnically Russian, and basically then absorb it into Russia proper, and then kind of, potentially divide other parts of the country off. So that's what I would be worried about if I were the Ukrainians, is definitely these two getting sectioned off, or these two getting connected here and sectioning off this area of the country there, which would also, it would prevent, the substantial forces that are over here from being able to, be easily withdrawn back towards the Kiev area. Now, so we know that the Russians are in Kherson, and allegedly they took the bridge down here, and then, and according to the Russians, they've controlled the city. According to the Ukrainians, they do not. So whether they actually control the city or, enough to perform their operations, I don't really know. They're definitely going to be meeting resistance there. But that's very worrisome from an operational standpoint, because once they break out of this and they have access to easily get across the Crimea and now be across the Dnieper River proper, there's nothing as far as major geographical barriers that prevents them from trying to both go north to link up with Kiev and to go west towards Odessa. And so I'm starting to lean towards the idea that this thrust is going to be going west towards Odessa after the complete and total retard that is the president of Belarus. And if you ever listen to the guy, just watch him, like when they do talks, and like he's an actual retard. So I mean that legitimately. So he had a map up when he was doing a briefing yesterday or whatever it was, and kind of showed all these military movements and thrusts like that. And they had arrows and things pointing to the Transnistria area of Moldova. So obviously, former, component country of the Soviet Union here in Moldova as well. So obviously, coming across Kherson and moving to Odessa, so that would give access to, the small country of Moldova here, which would put the Russians in control of substantial parts, if it does work out, of eastern Ukraine, of southern and western Ukraine. And then if they control Kiev, they basically politically sever all of the country from itself there. And so now, a couple things to keep in mind is that, I think everybody's enjoying watching the Russians kind of make a fool of themselves militarily, and seeing the Ukrainians show some serious backbone and put up stiff resistance. But we do have to know that Ukraine cannot beat Russia. They cannot. Ukraine is it's roughly like a third or a fourth of the size total population wise of Russia itself. But obviously Russia has Belarus helping it now as well. Militarily speaking, they're outmatched in totality. If they were to lose any more of their airfields and not be able to operate in the air, the only thing that's kind of really keeping them alive right now is that they are still able to get some air assets up. And for some reason, the Russians have not been able to establish total air supremacy. And the Ukrainians have made very good usage of drones, especially Turkish drones. And so they've been able to, and the Turkish drones don't carry very much of a payload, but they've still been able to prosecute operations from the air. And so they've still been able to hit some of these columns, these logistics columns and armored columns and things as they get bogged down, or as they run out of fuel or waiting on logistics and things like that. But, if and when they lose the ability to get, air assets, the game's basically up. Because the other side of it is that on paper, Ukraine has a good amount of armor and artillery. I mean, not compared to Russia as a whole, but enough to be able to make a very good showing of themselves. But once you have no control of the air, or no ability to at least move the enemy out of your airspace, it's very difficult to use artillery, because obviously as soon as you start using it, the enemy can just call in air assets on that. So those are things to keep to kind of keep your eye on. When it comes to these things, is kind of the potential merging of the Kursk and one of the kind of split off here of the Crimean thrusts, which would make battle over here much harder for the Ukrainians, much easier for the Russians, and then logistically this would help shore up a lot of problems. So whatever Crimean issues they have, being able to also supply them through these areas up here, and then keep an eye on whether or not the Russians move west, here out of Kherson and move west towards Odessa, here, or if they do try to run this thrust up towards Kiev, um, and assist there. So it's it's interesting times. It'll be interesting to see kind of how it plays out. The Ukrainians have they've shown us some good things. As far as one, why you do not want to do large scale operations in urban environments. Why you do not want to do large scale armored operations in urban environments without substantial infantry support. I think we've all been kind of, there's a lot of really good, really funny videos of the Ukrainians, using their Molotovs and things like that. But one thing I do want, to make sure that we all understand is that Molotovs do not kill tanks. That there's just they're not particularly effective against heavy armor, and they're not really effective against most if any sort of armored vehicle, unless they have hatches open or something. You're actually able to throw them inside. What the what the primary kind of usage of the Molotov cocktail was historically, and the way that the British and the Germans and the Soviets trained in World War II was that you throw, especially if you've done a good job of gelling up the fuel source in there so that it'll, stick and burn for a longer amount of time, is you throw these up and around you know, the, uh, the racks on the back of tanks and, where the air intakes for the engines and things are. And so depriving the engine of oxygen is a way to, kind of force a mobility kill. Which then obviously makes the vehicle easier to deal with, with some form of legitimate anti-tank weapon, whether, an anti-tank rocket, another tank, a cannon, whatever it happens to be on that. So obviously the Ukrainians have been getting in, javelins and NLAWs and like legitimate, like anti-tank things that can take out, the best of the armor that's, available in the world. And so that's good. But, the other thing that we've kind of seen a lot of, the RPG-7 is just the weapon that would not die. If you make it right the first time, like you don't have to make it again. So lots of those. And then RPG-18s and 22s and things, basically copies of like our, M72 Law rockets. So you see a lot of usage of those, which I think is good. And it's for me, it's very fascinating because we're kind of starting to, see why it was that we used to do things that we did, and it's a lot of the lessons that we learned in previous conflicts. Which is, one thing I'm always kind of stuck on is when you look at, sort of the latter days of World War II, and any pictures or any videos of the German Wehrmacht, is like when you see them, marching or in some ways moving units. There's two things that you see that pretty much everybody is carrying. One, they have belts of ammo for the MGs, and they have Panzerfausts, over their shoulders walking, and so. And that's kind of, what you're seeing sort of with Ukraine as well, which is that, everybody carries some form of roughly effective man-portable, anti-armor weapons. And if you can't engage main battle tanks, but you can engage trucks or you can engage armored personnel carriers like their BRDMs and BTRs and BDMs and BMPs and everything like that is, again, it's effective. It helps keep the infantry away from the armor, which, like I said, we need that, in urban ops especially, but just in general to be effective. And then, there's a big psychological component to that. It's like, if you're in a tank in a modern realm, unless you're facing a legit, Javelin, MLAW, or another tank, or I guess air power, you're pretty safe from just about everything the infantry has, except for, I guess, a couple like the TOW or other, like, crew serve very otherwise like, not super mobile anti-tank weapons. But when you see like, all the armored personnel carriers or all of your trucks or everybody else, getting blown up, getting bombed out, it definitely has a psychological effect on, how much people really want to go into areas because there's, without the infantry support. But then it's also, maybe you can't get a catastrophic blow the turret off and kill everybody inside kind of kill on a T-90 with, an AT-4 or something. But, you hit it in the track, make it a mobility kill, or in some other ways, damage the turret, damage the gun, so that it's not, mobile or loses its, a firepower kill that we would call it. Then you're kind of always placed in, as an armored guy, you're placed in sort of a no man's land as well. Do you wait for somebody to come and get you, In the meantime, maybe the enemy finds something big enough to actually destroy you, or do you get out and make a run for it? And then obviously now you're subject to all the small arms related issues that exist in the area. But I thought I would just kind of try to make, update the best that we can here. So again, I'm working off the best information I can find on the internet. If you guys have better information or more, up to date information, please send it to me. I'm still trying to work on getting accurate casualty counts now. I came across some information today. I don't have it pulled up. Couldn't really verify much of it. It seemed pretty accurate, and like I was kind of talking at work, is this was out of the UK, and their estimate was that the Russians are somewhere around, this would have been accurate as of yesterday, somewhere around 6,000 KIA. And I was talking with, friends at work today, and I was like, I bet they're closing in on 10,000 KIA already. There's been, kind of personal videos that friends of mine who have friends that are overseas have, and just there's a lot of, individual cell phone videos of just gobs of dead Russians, kind of laying in the streets, laying in yards and things like that. So I've taken to, so if you guys, are the, GWAT vets or GWAT era military guys like myself, so we kind of use the term Afghan math, which is like any number that the Afghans use for how many people they have or how many people they killed or whatever, you always divide by 10. So if somebody says, oh, there's 200 potential, Taliban out there, it's 20 at most. And then if they say, oh, we killed 40 Marines, like, nope, it was 4 at most. And so with the Russians, I'm kind of doing the same thing. So I think the Russians the other day, like 1 or 2 days ago, had admitted that they had, I think it was like 458 KIA. I'm like, all right, so take that times 10, and now you're getting into the ballpark. So I think that's more or less what's going to be kind of my approach for the time going. But remember, guys, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.